The FIT exhibition persuasively demonstrates how LBGT people have enlisted fashion as a vehicle to express their identities by appropriating and reinterpreting the binary sartorial codes borrowed from mainstream culture, codes that signify femininity and masculinity, or what the curators describe as the fop and the dandy. These social conventions are so deeply ingrained in our cultural unconscious that they tend to go largely unnoticed. However, queers are not unlike expatriates living on foreign soil who have a heightened sense of the unfamiliar customs and protocols that natives take for granted. Fashion designers, and as I will argue in my short talk, architects, I think, are adept at doing what queers do instinctively, detecting and highlighting the social conventions that shape gender performance. Queer enclaves make explicit this link between cladding and clothing. Like queer fashion, queer interiors also present exaggerated versions of hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity. For example, the decor of leather bars both complement and often match the clothing of its inhabitants. They typically combine multiple material references to macho environments that are etched in the collective unconscious. Materials like exposed brick on finished plank floors and steel plate and chain link all allude to construction sites, to biker bars and prisons. In a similar vein, drag clubs or drag club interiors, like the one depicted in the movie La Cage aux Folles, are outfitted with overblown versions of the fabrics and furnishings found in havens of femininity, like bordellos, nightclubs, and strip joints. However, these over-the-top queer haunts, I would argue, are exceptional. More often than not, gender codes tend to be less obvious in vanguard architecture than on the runway. Likewise, the exchange between queer subcultural styles and mainstream architecture also tend to be less explicit. Nevertheless, I would argue similar principles shape both design disciplines. Let me show you how. But two caveats. First, my remarks will focus exclusively on projects designed by influential gay male architects, as opposed to the works of interior designers or decorators. Let's start with the glass house and guest house. They're set back from the road behind protective stone walls and groves of trees in New Canaan. Johnson's secluded weekend retreat pays homage to that quintessential icon of minimalist modern domesticity, the Farnsworth House, designed for a female bachelor, Edith Farnsworth, by Johnson's mentor, Mies van der Rohe. Both structures exemplify the paradoxical strategies modern architects employ to engineer masculinity. At first glance, the stripped-down bachelor appears austere, understated. Less is more masculine. But the house conforms to modern architecture's framed prohibition against applied ornament, demonized for its association with feminine costume, artifice, and masquerade. Like a virtuous man, what you see is what you get. The minimalist shelter is composed only of a naked structural frame enclosed by transparent window walls. It's an exquisitely detailed, high-concept version of a humble cabin in the woods, filtered through the lens of Loget's iconic primitive hut, the actual paradigm of modernist, naked, natural, original structure. Although Paul Rudolph, who I'll now briefly talk about, was perhaps better known for the New York City townhouse owned by Halston, which is fabulous and was very influential. I instead will talk about his own house, 23 Beekman's Place, more idiosyncratic, and I would argue independent of queer style, one of maybe the 10 great interiors of modern architecture. At first glance, Rudolph's home is soberly dressed in the monochromatic masculine drag characteristic of late modernism. Its clean white surfaces, interlocking double-height spaces, exposed metal structure and handrails, all recycle familiar elements derived from Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. But Rudolph handles these veteran elements in a subversive way. Rudolph defies modernist precepts by laminating the structural I-beams in a thin veneer of highly reflected mylar, a flimsy fabric famously used by Warhol and vanguard fashion designers, whose effect was to dissolve edges and produce a kaleidoscopic effect. And likewise, Rudolph dematerializes the townhouse's horizontal surfaces, floors, stairs, balconies. He makes them all out of shiny white plastic and plexiglass, equally experimental materials that were favored by leading fashion and furniture designers of that period, but almost never used by architects. So I hope my talk has shed some light on both the affinities, but also the differences between queer fashion and queer architecture.